Good morning. Welcome to Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm Annalise Zawicki, and I serve as Vice President of the Live Oak Board of Trustees. This morning, Worship Associate Barbara Finch and Reverend Thomas Anastasi will be leading us in worship. We're glad that you are with us. Our congregation is one of respect and inclusion. We accept all people as they are, growing towards whom they may become. We know that our becoming happens in community, not in isolation. And so we welcome all those who hunger for a spiritual home of acceptance and love. We hope that if you're new to us and are seeking a spiritual home, that you will feel welcomed by the members of this congregation and will feel inspired to share with us your gifts. After worship, we hope we will have a chance to get to know you as we share coffee and tea and conversation on the patio. Today, there is a town hall meeting at 11:30 here in the sanctuary, so we invite everyone to join us. Everyone is encouraged to read the Akron Bulletin, which highlights the many ways that we create fellowship and put our values into action.
Yakub will be our chalice lighter.
Get the candle lit here.
Thank you, Dorothy. The words are printed on the video screens and also in your order of service. Deep within the womb of Mother Earth, the fire of creation burns brightly, churns as molten lava, fluid with power and possibility. May this chalice be a symbol of our eternal connection to that divine glow, the fire of the soul that sustains us through the tremors and aftershocks of life lived on the surface, the fire of love burning deep within our hearts, defying the faults and crevices that seem to divide us, the fire of commitment that nurtures community and spiritual growth.
Let us come into this house of promise and hope. Let us come rejoicing on this day that we may gather together with these people in this glorious communion of living faith and living regard. We affirm the principles and purposes which lead us to life, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equality, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the rights of conscience, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all people everywhere, and the respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. These are the principles to which we aspire, and we affirm them knowing that there is a space between where we are and where we want to be. But we look to these grand ideas as a place that is our destination. If you are new to us, whoever you are, and wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome to accompany us on this day for this great purpose and this great journey. Come, let us worship together. And let's begin with a song that may be new to some of you. It's in the blue book. It's called When I Am Frightened. It's page 1012.
Children or children at heart who would like to come up to this stage, we have a treat. Jim Ross is going to share our message for all ages today.
Good
morning. How are you guys? Good? Okay. Tired? Yeah, me too. Can you hear the tiredness in my voice? I have a question for you. First of all, how many folks out there recognize a book cover that looks like this? Yeah, you either had them read to you or you read them yourselves. These are the Berenstain Bear series of books. But I've got a question first. This morning, Reverend Thomas is going to talk about faults. What's a fault? Anybody know? Dorothy? You don't want to tell? Okay, yes, go ahead. I wish you could see the faces. Anybody? You know what? There's several definitions of the word fault. Anybody ever heard of the San Andreas fault? Yeah. And what happens along the San Andreas fault, do you know? Sometimes earthquakes. So there's a geological kind of fault. And then there's the kind of fault where it's your fault, right?
No.
Oh. It's somebody else's fault, right? All right, well, this is a story called The Blame Game. And if you guys know the Berenstain Bears, you know they live in this really nice-looking, neat little house, tree house in the forest, okay? And Mama keeps a nice, clean, quiet house as best she can with 2 children in the house, not to mention a husband. But lately, Mama hadn't been all that friendly. Her smile was gone, and she was feeling very discouraged. Why? Because life in the big treehouse had turned into one long, miserable, never-ending blame game. There's sister and brother. He started it. No, she started it. He started it. No, she started it. It was her fault. No, it was her fault. It was his fault. No, it was her fault. Cries of he started it, she started it, and so on and so on. Life in the big treehouse had become one long argument about who started it and whose fault it was. And Mama had had quite enough. What do you think Mama did? No. What? Well, let's find out. So when she heard the sound of breaking glass and spilling water, she rushed into the living room, and there she found a mess of broken glass, spilled water, and a scatter of roses on the floor. Standing over the mess were Brother and Sister Bear, and they were pointing at each other and shouting, "It was her fault. No, it was his fault," over and over again. "Enough of this blame game," she shouted. "I want to know who really started it, and I want to know right now." Well, it was like peeling back the layers of an onion. It was enough to make you cry. Mama might have if she hadn't been so angry. And the more Brother and Sister pointed and shouted, the angrier she got. "He knocked it over," cried Sister. "He made the mess, but that was only because she was trying to poke me in the ribs," shouted Brother. "I was not trying to poke him in the ribs," protested Sister. "I was just trying to tickle him because he tickled me this morning." Wait. "But that was because she tickled me last night." "But that was because he put a rubber snake on my bed." "But that was because she put a squeaky toy on my chair and it squeaked when I sat down." But, because, and so it went. Mama understood that she wasn't getting to the bottom of anything, but she was getting to the end of her patience. Her head was a whirl with butts, becauses, rubber snakes, squeaky toys, broken glass, spilled water, and scattered roses. "Enough!" she shouted. And of course, if you know the Berenstain Bears stories, this is the point where Father comes in and he says, "Enough of what?" He'd been fixing up the downstairs bay window and he heard the shouting. "From what I've heard," he said, looking at the mess on the floor, "there's more than enough blame to go around. So instead of playing the blame game, why don't we just get to work and solve the problem?" So he asks everybody involved to help. Sweep up the broken glass, mop up the water with paper towels, and he has Mama Bear pick up the roses very carefully so she doesn't cut herself. And when everything was done, Mama put roses into another vase. And Papa thought that was a good way to stop the blame game. Papa went back to his workshop. The cubs went outside to play, and then all of a sudden he heard a crash of glass. Now what? He rushed outside. The bay window he had just painted and puttied was broken. There stood brother and sister pointing at each other. Sister had a bat, brother had a glove. There was a baseball in the grass among the pieces of broken glass. Papa bit his lip, counted to 10, took a deep breath, and then exploded like a volcano. It was his fault. He's the one who wanted to play ball. He's the one who threw it. His fault, his fault, his fault. It was her fault. She's the one who hit it. Her fault, her fault, her fault. Now who comes into the picture, do you think? Again. "It seems to me," said Mama, who had heard the crash, "that instead of shouting and pointing fingers, we should get to work and solve the problem." And that's what they did. They picked up the glass, went to work. It took some time doing, but after a while, the window was painted and puttied and as good as new. And as Papa put the tools back in his tool shed with Sister Bear and Brother Bear, he said, "You know, Mama's probably right here. It's always easier to point fingers and say that it's somebody else's fault, but it's always more important to get the problem solved and get to work." Okay? So let's get to work sharing food with people who have less food than we do. Okay? All right. Thank you, guys.
For a moment. Notice the ridges of your fingerprints, the creases in your palms. Close your eyes gently and breathe into the wrinkles on your forehead. Relax your jaw. Melt into your chair like rainwater seeping into the thirsty cracks of the earth. Find your roots. Reach more deeply toward the molten core of the planet as your spirit soars upward beyond the clouds. In your mind's eye, behold the beauty of the mountains jutting into the sky, the canyons and creek beds and caverns that distinguish one sacred place from another, the contours of the earth shaped by the elements and the passing of time.
We really should put Kleenex out on the rows. There's been several times over the year that we really need. Are there any boxes of Kleenex around? I mean, they shouldn't be hidden. They should be out. You never know when you're suddenly going to erupt. It's been a good introduction to the theme today about faults, and I thank Jim for that great story. Just exactly down the line. We're talking about faults, and especially about this idea that the word fault has all these different meanings. So I'll tell you at the beginning that this is one of those dreaded metaphor sermons that, when I say one thing, I'm really talking about something else. But because there's one word that actually has 3 or 4 meanings, you may get lost along the way. And I'm pretty sure that I'll be lost along the way, too. So what does it mean? It's from Latin, fallere, and that means a mistake. So the dictionary says it means a weakness, a failing, especially a moral weakness. Imagine that. It's a good thing none of us have any faults like that. A physical or intellectual imperfection or impairment, a defect. It's also an error, especially in the service in a racket game like tennis. You have a fault, right? It means a misdemeanor. It means a mistake. It means the responsibility for wrongdoing or failure, like the accident was the driver's fault and the broken bay window was his fault, no her fault, no his fault. And fault also means it's a fracture in the crust of the planet with respect to the other, usually in the direction parallel to the fracture. And that's the definition that a lot of people think of when they hear the word faults, earthquake faults. And so I'd like to remind us that it was 33 years ago yesterday, May 18, 1980, that a massive earthquake struck Mount St. Helens in Washington State, causing a massive eruption of molten lava that killed 57 people and countless animals and much of the flora in that part of the world. The force of the earthquake caused the entire north face of the volcano to slide away, and that caused an explosion of rock and lava so powerful that it overtook the avalanche that was simultaneously occurring on the north face. The erupting lava rose to 80,000 feet in the air, and ash drifted into 11 states. The heat caused nearby glaciers to melt, which formed large mudslides that spread as far as 50 miles from the volcano. As it turned out, the region had already experienced earthquakes for 2 months prior to the eruption, and the volcano had been venting steam. So they kind of knew something was going to happen, and so they pressured the authorities to close Mount St. Helens, which is actually a national park, to the public, and that probably saved us several thousand lives, because there weren't just a lot of people there in the part which was covered up by ash and mud and lava. And by the time Mount St. Helens blew up, scientists knew very well about the fault deep inside the earth that would cause that earthquake. They knew about that fault there. And not only just that fault, but they know about many faults, especially out here on the West Coast and the whole Pacific Rim. And of course, the famous one, San Andreas Fault, right here in good old California. A large element of the scientists who study these things, and they're called seismologists, a large element of their job is fault finding. They are looking for faults wherever they can find it. And the idea is that they would be able to prevent injuries. That one day this fault is going to do something that will cause something to happen, mainly an earthquake, and they can sort of get ready for it. So earthquakes occur on faults. A fault is a thin zone of crushed rock between two blocks of rock and can be any length. When an earthquake occurs on one of these faults, the rocks on one side of the fault slips with respect to the other, and the fault surface can be vertical or horizontal or some angle in reference to the surface of the earth. Now, you do see these are all metaphors about faults. They can be horizontal or vertical. And when something happens, when the fault expires, when the fault decides to move, then the rocks on one side slip over to the rocks on the other side, and you end up with an earthquake. Another aspect of seismologists is that they always know that there is a master fault. It's a master fault. In California, it's the San Andreas. And nearly all of the faults are related to this big one. The metaphors are ringing here. I hope you're hearing the bells go off. And maybe you actually know about a master fault in your own life, your own personal geography, topography. And the seismologists tell us about another kind of fault they call unknown faults. What do we do about faults when we don't know they're there, can't see them, don't know about them? Do we have to wait till the next earthquake reveals them? As a matter of fact, fault finding and fault finding people can, if they're earnest enough, actually find those unknown faults. But it's not easy. It's not easy to find those faults which could one day erupt and completely wreck your life. Or wreck the city of San Francisco or LA or Santa Barbara. But there's some people that spend their whole life, and the study of the science is called geodesy. Did you know that word? Geo, which is the Greek word for earth. And it's related to the word geodesic and other places like that. So they're looking for faults. How do you measure a quake? Well, it's called magnitude. It's the magnitude of an earthquake. And this started with Richter, as you know. He borrowed the idea of magnitude from the astronomers' studies. And he said, well, here's how we can apply this to earthquakes. And so they've done that, and then they decided that Richter wasn't right and that they were really more interested in the energy that is released rather than how far the thing moves. And so they've changed it all along the way, and now they have what they call earthquake dimensions with different magnitude scales. And each scale measures something or other about the nature of the fault and the nature of what happened in that fault to cause the earthquake. So can we predict earthquakes? Even if we know where the fault is, can we say, well, this thing is going to blow up? And of course, they say that all the time. We're going to have the big one. Up in Seattle, we used to say, the big one's coming, and they expected a 9 magnitude quake up there one day, and it's all coming. We all know it's coming, but yet they can't predict when it's going to come. And in human life, this is called psychoanalysis. where you look for the faults and you predict when they're going to blow up. And then you go from there. The biggest earthquake I was ever in was in Seattle on February 28th, 2001, which happens to be my daughter's birthday, and it was her 25th birthday that day. It was just east of Olympia. It was called the Nisqually earthquake, and it had a magnitude of 6.8, pretty big. And the magnitude of my daughter's life story is also quite shaking and has magnitude of its own. We're waiting for the big one, and that does really bring it around for me back to my psychology and my spirituality and what kind of master fault that I have inside of me that will one day erupt into some kind of world-shaking or life-shaking event for me. And that the little thing that's written on your order of service was a note that I found anonymously on my desk one day that said, "The greatest wound is where your greatest gift is located." So your biggest master fault may also be where your salvation lies. And isn't that an interesting correlation of things in our lives? So if we talk about faults as having to do with character defects or flaws, and then we talk about moral seismologists who take up their duty as fault finders for other people, like the famous biblical story about the woman caught in adultery. And this story is currently being told in lots of places around the world where Sharia, the Islamic law, dictates the law of the land. And Sharia or Sharia says that an adulterer should be stoned to death. They still do that in some places because God told them to do that in some places. And curiously, when this happened, when Jesus was hanging around one day, he said, wait, before you start the stoning, the only person that can do this is one who is without sin, who doesn't have any faults. If you're going to start pointing out other people's faults and punishing other people for their faults, you're only allowed to do that if you don't have any yourself. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her, he said. And people went away quietly because they realized that we all have that fault somewhere. I bet you never thought about fault being a synonym for sin. But it's one that we're allowed to use as Unitarians since we're not allowed to use the word sin. So it's so easy to see other people's faults, isn't it? It's easy to see other people's faults. And when we're making judgments about other people's behavior, like that woman caught in adultery, sometimes if we're really honest, we'll realize that the judgment that we're making is actually a judgment about ourselves. Imagine that kind of correlation. Something that emanates inside of the judge is causing the fault finding to happen. There's a neat little reference in St. Paul's letter to the Romans. He said, "Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things." How many of those rock throwers have been committing adultery? Imagine that. And that's just one story. That's just one way that we judge people. It's a popular way, I'll say that. Anything having to do with sex is popular to be talked about and judged. So one of these days, maybe we want to think about our own faults and how it is that we are finding those faults or not finding those faults. And we can look at lots of different ways of that happening. I have some stuff here about a fault finder named Benjamin Franklin, who at the beginning of this country kind of set up a standard of rules about how to live a life that was faultless. Faultless. And we could go into that, but it's so incredibly wrong as far as reality goes that there's not really a whole lot to do. So let's just skip that part and go forward to the part about me and about Live Oak and about congregations here, the congregation here, and fault finding. Now you know, surely you know, that as the interim minister, part of my job is fault finding. To find out what things lie underneath the surface here at Live Oak that could possibly erupt. And one way I could do this is just like what seismologists do or geologists do. I look at the history. When was there an earthquake around here? And you all are very good about telling me about that. And thank you. Thank you very much. There have been some earthquakes here. And so part of my job is to look at that and say, okay, is that likely to happen again? Is there a way that we can keep an earthquake from happening again? At least in the same spot, in the same fault that is there. And so we're in the process of fault finding here, you and I together, as we do this transition year together. And so we can look at it just like the seismologists do and be very aware, first of all, that there are faults everywhere, especially in California, and Goleta is in California. So there are faults down there, and we need to know that. We need to remember that the faults are really there. And we need to know that sometimes we don't know where they are. We don't know the nature of them. We don't know how far beneath the surface they are. We don't know how dangerous they are, how maybe they would cause everything to erupt and everything to fall apart. And so we look at this and we make a study of it. And we do things like have our conversation salons where we talk about these things and exchange information, exchange ideas about the nature of this kind of thing. And so it is that we go. And one way that this really works is to ask each of us ourselves, what kind of faults do I have that might contribute to a community earthquake? What's going on inside of me that I might want to be looking at? And so we look at those faults. And I want to, I have another sermon that I want to do sometime, maybe next year on my way out, so that if you're mad about it, you don't have time to do anything about it. But it's about confession. And confession, what it is you talk about your faults. And the process in the Roman church is you walk into this little room and you say, I have faults, and here they are. And you confess your faults, one to another. And the idea is that you will be healed from them and saved from them, so that they are no longer a danger to the topography and the geography of your soul. That the faults will not cause your soul to fall apart. So I want to talk about my fault. And this may or may not be a communal thing. But my fault is that I won't let myself I won't forgive myself for my faults. I take them and I hold them close to me, and I won't let them go. And that can kill me if I'm not careful. That can kill me. And the reason I know that is the events of this last couple weeks in my own life, in that we are going through some really hard times right now. And Bob, in this last week, actually was on death's door for a while. And I'm the caretaker, the spouse, and I'm there holding his hand, and I have a tendency to not think about anything about me, but only about him. And in the meantime, the faults inside of me are beginning to tremble, so that I realized I could fall apart if I'm not careful. Many of you know what I'm talking about. You've been there. You know that those faults can begin to rumble, and if you're not very careful, they can have devastating effects on your life. And this is why the church is so important. It's so important because we can come here and we can share that with each other. Yeah, we can confess our faults one to another, and there might even be a healing process that takes place in that. But to be able to come together with people that you love and that love you, who understand that they're not going to judge you for your faults, but instead are going to reach out and hold your hand and say, let's go through this together. Imagine having that kind of place. And imagine how many people don't have that kind of place in their lives. They don't have a place where they can go and be embraced by what I really want to call the beloved community of faith. The beloved community where people love one another, care for one another. They don't judge one another, but instead accept one another and commit themselves to healing one with the other, individually and as a community. I strongly believe that Live Oak is in the process of healing right now. We are healing. And even though there have been earthquakes in the past, we're together and we're healing, and people are coming back to church again after being gone, and we're holding ourselves together with this true regard for one another. So this is a good time, and those of you who join the church today, this is a good time to join this congregation because we are healing. We are together. And even though I'm an outsider and I'm not a member and I probably won't even be around after my job ends here, I want to thank you for being who you are and what you are. But right now in my life, I need you. I need you. And I'm so happy that you're here and that your arms are outstretched and that you want to be together. Amen. Amen. So let's sing our final hymn. Choose to bless the world. Your gifts, whatever you discover them to be, can be used to bless or to curse the world. The mind's power, the strength of the hands, the reaches of the heart, the gift of speaking, listening, imagining, seeing, waiting. Any of these can serve to feed the hungry, to bind up wounds, to welcome the stranger, to praise what is sacred, to do the work of justice, and to offer love.